You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 14th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio.
US Special Prosecutor says he could have nailed Donald Trump on election interference, prompting pointed questions re why he didn't. Residents of one Ghanaian city attempt to revive the pandemic-era statue toppling craze. And is it time to stop air passengers having beer for breakfast? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Alex von Tunzelmann and Theo Usherwood will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll have some audio on the subject of silent movies. How is that going to work? Let's find out. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Alex von Tunzelmann, historian, author and screenwriter, and Theo Usherwood, political journalist and broadcaster. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Good evening.
We're back.
We're back.
Or at least
You're back.
I'm back, and that's literally all that matters. Yes, no, I decanted yesterday afternoon from a very long flight to Australia, so I'm just letting you both know at this early juncture, if at any point you just sort of see me drifting off, it's no particular reflection on the company or the conversation, but just that you may have to pick up the show yourselves somewhat, talk amongst yourselves, etc. Alex, what did you do for Christmas? How did you spend it?
Well, very nice, quiet one in London. And we were talking about how we have non-traditional Christmases. We had a Lebanese buffet for Christmas lunch.
Oh, that sounds delicious.
It was lovely.
I had a Lebanese dinner in Sydney on New Year's Day, which was also lovely, but it's hard to go too far wrong with Lebanese food.
It's pretty great.
So, Lebanese buffet in London versus Theo, what did you do?
A burger and chips in a hotel in Canary Wharf. It's halfway between.
Did you get suddenly divorced on Christmas Eve?
No, I didn't. No, thank you. No, I didn't. Christmas, I think we just took the view that it's halfway. There's a nice hotel, which is perfectly great, and it's halfway between our house and where my mother-in-law lives, and we just thought it much easier to just everybody to camp there and have dinner. And we looked at the menu and we were sort of getting nervous because there are some fussy eaters in my family, and they looked and we were thinking about do they really want turkey, or they're going to substitute the turkey for the nut roast. And then we just all sort of did a sigh and just said, let's have burger and chips.
So all this talk of Lebanese food and burger and chips is making me quite hungry. I spent most of Christmas Day itself, if we're playing unorthodox Christmas top trumps, being driven from Sydney Airport to Canberra in a four-wheel drive vehicle, which I think is somewhere in the vicinity of 40 years old, by my 19-year-old nephew, who likes things like 40-year-old four-wheel drives.
And did he drive well?
He drove extremely sensibly and soberly, and, well, got me there in one piece. I should stress that as Australian drives go, Sydney to Canberra is relatively stress-free. I mean, the road is paved, right, and everything. But yes, so that was how I spent Christmas
But you do
Day.
have to have some of the cars. You have bull bars, don't you? Because you do have dingoes and kangaroos and out in the outback that can smash in your car.
Cars which do actual proper outback driving are fitted with, actually they're now more often referred to as rhubars than bull bars, because that is what you are more likely to hit. And all jokes aside, an accident between a kangaroo and a vehicle travelling at some speed usually works out pretty badly for everybody. I did see, however, a lot of kangaroos, because near where my brother lives in Canberra, there are many.
Fantastic.
But we will start by contemplating the parallel universe in which, at some juncture in the last 4 entire damn years they had to get this done, the US Department of Justice had bestirred itself to actually bring proceedings against a would-be putschist bent on dismantling the constitutional order, as opposed to sitting around waiting for him to get elected president again. Special counsel Jack Smith, who led the investigation into President-elect Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election, which he lost, has released a report claiming that the evidence he assembled was sufficient to convict Trump. Alex, what has everyone been doing?
Well, pretty much smacking their foreheads and saying, why did you not get this out earlier? Which, of course, isn't Jack Smith's fault directly.
It's not.
I think a lot of the blame today is probably rightly being pointed at Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, who was very slow to launch such an investigation and prosecution, did so at a rather leisurely timescale, whereas, that could have been done immediately after the January the 6th incident. It wasn't. And by the time we were all around and ready, Trump was already being elected, and therefore this became effectively impossible.
Do we have to accept, Theo, and it is an unpleasant thought, that a plurality of Americans, at least 80 million, judging by the last presidential election, simply don't care?
Yes, I think probably more than that. I mean, you're talking about a parallel universe and the way things turn out. Just supposing that he had been convicted and sent to prison, what that would have done, given so many, 80 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, and the split that we would have seen, the seismic split that we would have seen as a result. I think America, there were those on both sides of the divide prior to the election, and I was doing a series of podcasts on it, who were very worried about the country spilling over into civil war. This is a country that knew civil war 200 years ago. And so I think actually you could take the view that, OK, it didn't happen fast enough and therefore Donald Trump is president. But you could also, I think, equally say, actually, it let the pressure out of the system, that America had its voice, it elected Donald Trump. And as the Biden, the Democrats discovered with Joe Biden back in 2020, the best way to defeat Donald Trump is not by putting him in prison, but by defeating him at the ballot box. And I think the question now for the Democrats and any left-of-centre politician is, and indeed those right of centre who don't like Donald Trump, is to find a way to defeat Donald Trump, not to necessarily fret over what might have been.
It's probably true, Alex, and this may have been a factor in Merrick Garland's deliberations, that prosecuting Donald Trump, certainly imprisoning Donald Trump, may have occasioned a great deal of uproar. But is that something that should be taken into account, or do you think, well, it's the law? You may have broken it and proceedings should be enacted accordingly? Because we have in more recent times seen examples of democracies, notably Brazil and South Korea, acting with rather greater alacrity.
Well, absolutely. And I think I would come down very strongly on I am not especially bothered about public opinion in this situation. The point should surely be the rule of law and, and having some kind of integrity to democracy and some kind of challenge to those who wish to overturn it. Not necessarily popular to do so, but I don't think the point is a popularity contest. And in terms of the election, I think Theo is probably broadly right that it wouldn't necessarily have actually hurt Trump's chances. I still don't think that's the point. I think the law should surely be enforced. The Constitution should be upheld. The fact it hasn't been is pretty worrying. And now we're in a situation where, the Supreme Court has ruled on presidential immunity. We're in all sorts of, new territory with all of this. And it's very unclear where that's going to lead.
The question arises, Theo, it's a fairly fundamental one in a democracy especially, whether anybody is or should be above the law in any sense. And obviously in the United States, there's a number of quirks and curiosities attached to that. One of the reasons the charges against Trump have all been dropped is that there is a precedent that you don't pursue the president of the United States while they're in office. And actually, you can make an argument for that, given that he could be possibly subject to endless nuisance lawsuits, which would stop him doing his job. There's also the fact that the United States is one of those countries where the head of government is also the head of state and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Does that or should that make anything different?
So I just want to briefly, I'll answer that second. I just want to briefly pick up with Alex's point. I think if you remember back to the January the 6th, it was an insurrection, right? If you think back and Donald Trump's role in that, I think everybody was, I remember a rallying round, of course, led, Mike Pence spoke out against it. He was very clear about where he stood on it. There was a moment, I think, which is much shorter than the 3.5 years that preceded the last election, just immediately after that, where I think actually if Donald Trump was going to face criminal justice proceedings successfully and be convicted, that it needed to be done within a very short period of time. The reason I say that is because, as we saw during the election campaign, Trump is a master of turning the establishment, quote, and I use inverted commas around that, against, using that against his opponents. That this was, you remember that famous advert he did, the only reason they're trying to get to me is because I'm standing in the way of them getting to you. He was like a mobster. He was like a mobster, that he was able to use that against them. And so I think if you had drawn that conviction out into late 22, into 2023, I think then it would become very, very dangerous in terms of stability of American society and the possibility of civil war. If you'd done it immediately, I think there would have been a much higher chance of conviction and then the story being able to dissipate safely. And I just make that small distinction. In terms of his role, I think it... it's like comparing Donald, we would like to say, and I think it's too easy to say, you could compare Donald Trump to, say, Keir Starmer, and you'd never think that Keir Starmer, as the Prime Minister of this country, or indeed a Prime Minister elsewhere, is above prosecution. But of course, we know that the royal family enjoys very huge privileges and immunities which stretch well beyond the law as it applies to ordinary people, say, here in the UK. And the same is true in other countries. And I think we should be wary of necessarily being particularly snobbish about saying, well, America can't, America has these quirks or these idiosyncrasies within its judicial system that precludes Donald Trump from a successful conviction whilst he's sitting in office, because we only have to look at the way that members of royal families right across Europe, or indeed people in very high office, are able to avoid their respective criminal justice jurisdictions, to see that this is, America is not an outlier in this regard.
Just a final thought on this, Alex, and it's a broader historical context plus one of my pet theories of recent American history. Is this somehow all Gerald Ford's fault? What is the parallel universe in which he decides, no, I'm not pardoning Richard Nixon, and I don't care that he is the person who appointed me vice president, and I don't care that he is a member of my party. If he's broken the law, he should answer for it.
Well, we could go back further. Is it all Ulysses S. Grant's fault? I think
George Washington has a case to answer.
A very good question of whether, after the US Civil War, the Confederate leaders should have been hanged, not pardoned, and that would have set a very different precedent. It would be very interesting to see from a historical point of view. I would just say quickly, in response also to Thea's point, that I think lots of us think it's absolutely appalling that royal families are exempt from these sorts of prosecutions, and certainly wouldn't defend that either, just to be very clear. I mean, it's a pretty despicable situation all round. But no, I think historically, and this... Essentially, Nixon was actually held to account, ultimately, rather more. Yes, OK, fine.
He jumped before he was pushed.
Jumped before he was pushed, sure. But there was some sense of a rule of law being at least kind of, vague. I mean, he stopped being president. He was regarded as a crook. He was shamed. We're in a very different situation from that in this situation. And I think it's really, really hard to know how this will go. And I also think the kind of recriminations that people are having today and so on, which of course are in the past because, the ship has sailed. He hasn't been prosecuted. It's now not going to happen. And I also would agree with Thea's point that actually it should have happened very, very fast if it was done at all. I mean, you couldn't have a clearer illustration of the maxim of justice delayed is justice denied, as exactly what's happened today. Yeah. But, I do think that we're in very new territory now. And I think a lot of these recriminations and kind of complaints and stuff we're seeing, we will see what happens over the next 4 however long years. And I think people will then, look back at this and say, was that the right or wrong decision? How did these people comport themselves? It's very difficult because we are in very uncharted waters.
Well, staying in the United States, the fires besetting Los Angeles are far from extinguished and may indeed get even worse. Winds have recently picked up and residents of Southern California are being warned of, quote, extremely difficult fire conditions. Nevertheless, at some point thought will have to be given to the future, a future which is scheduled to include 3 years hence an Olympic Games. Such an event places places a considerable strain on the capacities of any host city, never mind one which is, as Los Angeles surely will be, still in the process of rebuilding. Theo, there's a couple of ways they could approach this. One, I guess, is the probably unlikely one that they just realise, we can't do this, we should find another host city. Is there a possibility, though, that something like this, once the fires are extinguished, one hopes sooner rather than later, obviously, it becomes kind of a rallying point that you can get a city to aim at, just saying, look, people, we've got 3 years to turn ourselves into a venue worthy of the Games?
Very much the latter, I think. When I saw the way that this... your take on this story about how, Los Angeles comes out of this, these apocalyptic scenes, these apocalyptic fires. I drew my mind back to 9/11 and the photographs of the immediate aftermath of the Twin Towers coming down, and then the photographs that I think, if I remember correctly, 2 or 3 days later of ground zero, completely. The work that had been done to at least bring some sort of order, to clear away the rubble, to find any survivors that were trapped underneath the debris, and actually bring New York back to some normalcy. There is no country better, in my view, of rejuvenation, of finding its way out of a disaster than America. It has a fantastic, it is a nation of doers, and I am sure that it will be able to, LA will be able to come back stronger. Indeed, one of my... Thinking back to last summer and watching the Olympics, I almost felt sorry for the French, because I thought Snoop Dogg, the pictures of him dancing along when Simone Biles won at the gymnastics, or Noah Lyles crossed the line first to win a gold in the 100 metres. I thought Snoop Dogg stole the show in many respects, and I just couldn't wait to see what LA does in 2028. But I think it's going to be fascinating. I'm sure that there will be a point of rejuvenation. What I think is perhaps more pertinent, just away from the Games, is, what do Americans do? How does it come back? The insurance industry, do they pay out? We're talking billions of dollars to those who have lost their homes. Those homes will not be able to be, we would have thought, being rebuilt on the ground in those areas, because they'll just be subject to fires again. And where do those residents of the city? What happens to them? Where do they go? Where do they look? I remember I was listening to a radio program the other day about Americans starting to look towards the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina, and then of course they were hit by the recent hurricanes. Climate change is happening. It's only going to get worse as a result of the fact that various governments, high polluting governments around the world, aren't going to change course. It is a question of what happens to the American demographics and geographics in looking ahead to the next 3 or 4 years.
We were talking in the previous item, Alex, about different Americas, different times, etc. And while I think Theo is right about America's capacity to rebuild, reinvent, rejuvenate, America has become slightly different in recent years for obvious reasons, in that if you think back 20, 30 years, I don't think an event like this becomes a subject of the sort of inane partisan bickering that we have seen go on even as the fires are still burning. And of course, modern social media gives vent to just extraordinary conspiracy theories explaining what is really going on here. Does all of that impede the ability of actually serious people to try and get something big done, like rebuild a city in time to host an Olympic Games?
I don't know if it gets in the way of that. I think it's more of a kind of just background irritant to a lot of people who are still trying to put out the fires around their houses, to be kind of presented with all these conspiracy theories and this kind of ridiculous misinformation that's going around. I tend to agree with Theo that I think LA, actually, I'm expecting the Olympics to be triumphant, if anything. I think the challenge presented by bouncing back from this, the possibility of pulling together as a community, will be absolutely huge. And I think that will happen. And I hope it will be a great triumph and a uniting thing. But I also think there's a really important point here that, that first of all, you've got potentially a very hostile federal government in the next few years for for California, a government that has been pretty vocal coming in about the Trump administration about not liking California.
Although, ironically, there are more Trump voters in California than in any other state.
There are, because it's so large. Actually, it has more registered Republicans and more Trump voters. It's absolutely huge. But nonetheless, it is sort of painted, if you like, as this, hippie liberal state. I mean, of course, ignoring the fact that the aforementioned Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, etc., but I mean, it's about a kind of culture war, which are not very strongly connected to reality a lot of the time. And I think, there's already been talk from some Republicans of denying California federal funding and so on. That's something that Biden has immediately put in straight away, in his kind of last week in office. So I think there is potentially a money issue, and I think that's probably connected to the very important issue Theo raised of the insurance. The state insurance policy as it currently exists in California is clearly woefully inadequate to rebuild people's, particularly sort of individuals' property, let alone anything else. And I think there's going to be huge strain on the state of California, which also, if I remember rightly, has some slightly curious law where they can't raise taxes without a positive vote from Californians. Naturally, everybody...
good luck with that.
Yes, quite. Everybody asks, would you like more stuff? Says yes. Would you like to pay for it? No. So there's a bit of a sort of fundamental issue there.
Well, to Ghana now, where the cityscape of Sekondi Takoradi in the country's west has been reduced to the tune of one statue. A representation of former President Nana Akufo-Addo, raised towards the end of last year, has been unceremoniously unraised. Akufo-Addo is now a former president, having reached his term limit before December's election. Unveiling the statue of himself was one of his last acts in office. It is not yet clear who de-plinth'd the statue of Akufo-Addo, but given the quality of the likeness, it would not be entirely surprising to discover that it was Akufo-Addo himself. Alex, first of all, are you able to recommend to our listeners, by any faint chance, a book, perhaps, on the theory and practice of statue removal, iconoclasm, etc.?
Well, there is indeed a book by me, Alex von Tonselman, called Fallen Idols, available in all good bookshops for you now. But yes, absolutely. This is sort of a rather amusing story, I think. I mean, certainly if you look at the statue, this is really not one of those cases where you're terribly worried about a great work of art.
It's not a classic,
being vandalised. No, I mean, I would have thought several million suspects, quite possibly on the list at the moment. But pulling down statues is something that is actually in the Ghanaian tradition as well as a wider African and international tradition. There's a statue of Kwame Nkrumah, for instance, in Ghana that was pulled down during the kind of unrest after he was ousted and broken to pieces, and the head was stolen. And the head was later returned, and it is now displayed as a headless statue with the head on a separate plinth next to it, which I particularly like because now it's a work that commemorates both Nkrumah and also the violence after his role. So I think it's kind of a much more interesting historical object.
Theo, a leading question. It's never really an encouraging sign, I don't think. I couldn't think of any counterexamples when a serving politician unveils a statue of themselves.
No, and what I was a little bit surprised by was I thought it would have been made of some valuable, metal or semi-precious metal, I don't know, gold leaf or something, I don't know. But it's a mixture of metal wire, mesh and clay and fiberglass and resin. So even if it was smashed to bits, I don't think those who smashed it to bits would have actually managed to walk off with anything particularly valuable.
I think, as Alex suggests, that there was something quite pure-hearted about this. I think they just either smashed it up because they thought the statue was ugly or they didn't like the bloke it represented very much. It reminded
me, when I looked at it, I couldn't think to myself where I'd seen such a statue that is, unflattering perhaps, or just not very, not a huge level of artistic credibility. And it was the Cristiano Ronaldo statue was the one that I was reminded of. And as Alex was speaking, sorry if I didn't quite come back very quickly on your point, Alex, but I was trying to find this Cristiano Ronaldo statue to draw a comparison. But I think on a more serious point, of course, Ghana has suffered has suffered quite the economic downturn and hardship. I mean, it's got a bailout, isn't it, that they're waiting on now. They needed £2.5 billion from the International Monetary Fund. And I think this is probably just another example of, people in countries which are struggling economically, having little time or patience with grandiose political projects that do nothing for local populations, and that actually you can build a statue to yourself, but quite rightly people want to see, they want to see bread on their table, they want to be able to work, they want to be able to house and clothe their families. And when you have statues like these, which are just nothing more than vanity projects, people have little patience. And this is, I'm sure, Alex, you've written about this. This is a trend.
Very little patience.
This is a trend we've seen all over globally.
But on the subject, just finally on this, of that being a trend, Alex, does it seem to you that the big statue toppling craze of a few years back has dwindled somewhat?
Oh, yes, it's definitely fallen into a bounce, although we did see a revival in Syria, of course, recently, with lots of statues of Bashar al-Assad and members of his family torn down,
a target-rich environment, that one.
A very target-rich environment. I think, this goes in waves. You get a wave of it every few years. And I mean, the big one to watch, of course, the world's number one statue putter-upper at the moment is Kim Jong-un. Lots of statues of himself and his family.
Can I ask a question?
Go right ahead.
When it comes to statues, do you sometimes think that for those, when there is a regime change, that for the rebels coming, for want of a better word, toppling the statue is the moment where you say you've won? So if it's not a game, but just supposing it was a game and you needed to be able to say, I win the game of Monopoly or I win the game of Scrabble, in that moment of toppling the statue, you could say, the old regime is out and we are now in charge.
Yeah, it's a symbolic assassination.
Yeah.
And that's why we've seen it a lot. And actually there's a huge wave of it, of course, recently before the current war in Ukraine, with statues of Lenin being torn down because they were thought to represent Russian control. And Russian soldiers in parts of Ukraine have actually put them back up. So there's been a very interesting dynamic going on there as well. So yes, absolutely. And it's something that, even the Egyptian pharaohs used to pull down statues of the previous ones to put up new ones to establish their new legitimacy. So this is really a tale as old as time.
Well, to a rebuke now to the peculiarly British and Irish belief that once inside an airport, time, as is commonly understood, simply does not exist, and that 7 a.m. is a perfectly acceptable juncture at which to commence drinking. Budget airline Ryanair, whose passengers are among the more enthusiastic adherents of this tradition, want a stop put to it. Ryanair is demanding that limits be imposed of 2 alcoholic drinks per person at airports. This follows a lawsuit brought by Ryanair against an unruly passenger who may have overdone it prior to embarking from Dublin for Lanzarote, necessitating a diversion which cost circa €15,000, which is approximately the price most reasonable people would charge to board a Ryanair flight from Dublin to Lanzarote. Theo, are you now, or have you ever been yourself, an early airport drinker?
I'm pretty much teetotal, so I'm probably not the best person to ask. I think this is quite an interesting... I read this story and I'm just trying to think about going to airports. I think this is quite an interesting dynamic between who gets to make the money out of flying. Because we've seen cut-price airlines, like Ryanair, slashing their prices. And where do they make their money? They make their money selling drinks on board. Now, if you've preloaded, I think that's the right term, with 5 pints beforehand, you're not going to buy the drinks on board. You're not going to buy necessarily the scratch cards.
I don't think having 5 pints is going to stop a lot of people.
But when you go to an airport, I would imagine the problem that the airport authorities have got is that they want to charge sky-high rents to the pubs and the cafes and the venues inside the departure lounges in what was the duty-free section. And they can only do that. They can't do that if you then say, well, we're going to charge you more than you would charge than we would if you were perhaps just on the high street, and then we're going to limit what you can sell. Those companies need to make a profit at some point. And so I can't see a Wetherspoons ever accepting you can charge us so much money, but at the same time, you've got to limit what we can sell to people who want to get, for want of a better word, leathered before getting on the flight. That they would think that's acceptable. I think it's for Ryanair, I think they're on a losing streak here.
Hey, Alex, speaking as someone who has recently, in the last few weeks spent an untoward amount of time in airports, it does strike me that there is something about them that causes people to just abandon most standards of civilised adult behaviour. And I don't know whether there is something in the fact that once you're inside the airport, you are so completely regulated and so completely supervised that people retreat to almost this baby-like state in which they feel like they can dress any way they like, eat anything they like and behave any way they like.
Yes, I mean, you're in this sort of liminal space, which is effectively the bar and Alderaan from Star Wars. And, anything can happen. Time ceases to exist. Place ceases to exist. And it doesn't surprise me that to cope with going on Ryanair, people might need a drink. I think that's, probably quite reasonable, actually. But I think this is also to do with, Theo has a very good point about the financial aspects of it. I also think this is very much seems to be a Ryanair PR strategy, seems to be behave horribly to your customers and then make that as big an issue as possible. And you get all this press.
We should also mention that it's a not uncommon Ryanair policy to just suggest something outrageous that will get picked up by media and discussed on programmes such as this. I was almost going to do my usual spiteful thing of refusing to name the corporate entity in charge, but I figured in this case everybody would know who you were talking about anyway.
Yes, quite. But that's because this is their branding, right? Behave appallingly towards your customers. Say you're going to make them stand up on flights or something really terrible, and then release the story. Everyone talks about it. More press for you, with them described as budget airline, and you're sort of just hoping that all publicity is good publicity, and that somehow sort of seeps through the ether. But I have to say, I don't think I'll be going on the Dublin to Lanzarote time by choice anytime soon.
This story appears in the same week, Theo, that another story was in the news of a man who was convicted this week, in fact, for being both drunk and nervous, one as a consequence of the other, perhaps on an Amsterdam to New York flight, prompting a diversion to Dublin. And it occurred to me that in all the years that I have spent on planes, well, actually probably not collectively years, it would certainly be collectively weeks at this point, I would think. I've never seen anybody run properly amok on an aircraft. I wanted to ask you both in turn, have either of you seen somebody run amok on an aircraft, or perhaps been the person running amok on an aircraft?
We very nearly had an incident on our way back from Egypt, and we were flying with an airline that is now no longer functioning. And my wife, who is...
Which is British Airways.
No. It was a budget airline, and we'd had a week away in February. And my wife, who's a vegetarian and who is also very fastidious about how clean things are, found a rotting pepperami down the side of her seat and exploded just before takeoff. And we very nearly had... I had to be nice to the... air stewardesses and air stewards just not to get arrested on landing. It was not to be repeated.
Rotting pepperami down the side of a seat. Yeah, that's going to...
It was disgusting, but literally she got, those hand gels? She literally got 3 out and just started spraying them everywhere, including all over the family in front of us. It was something else.
Have you ever been in... Well, I mean, we should have ended on Theo, Alex. I suspect you're going to have trouble capping that.
Yes, although, I was recently on a flight from London to Las Vegas, which is quite a notorious route, again, for people, getting, as you say, leathered.
Imagine my shock.
I know. It was an overnight flight, and they were all sort of boomer generation people with clearly, money to burn, absolutely, tanking themselves up. Didn't get a wink of sleep. But then I heard from a friend of mine, so this story actually is his rather than mine, that on a flight that he got into Vegas, they kept announcing, if you're intoxicated when you land, the Americans won't let you in. And indeed, I'm afraid a group of lads managed to get themselves so intoxicated they were turned around by some very, very serious American security people, put straight back on the next plane. So, and I think they were taken off in handcuffs.
If it was bad enough for the people on the flight out, how much worse would it be for the people sharing the flight back with them? Or do the crew of that flight kind of stop serving at that point?
I would have thought they cut them off.
You would hope. Alex von Tunzelmann and Theo Usherwood, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, to many, silent film may be considered an anachronism, a relic of a bygone era consigned to film studies textbooks. But with the advent of digitisation and the rise of DVDs, the medium has experienced a remarkable resurgence, with increased access sparking renewed interest and bringing the silent film canon into sharper focus. As a result, a vibrant global community of silent film enthusiasts has emerged, dedicated to preserving and showcasing these works as they were originally intended to be seen, whether at silent film festivals, cine clubs or film societies. Monocle's Maisie Ringer has been delving into the world of silent film, exploring how the medium continues to thrive and captivate audiences. She heads to the Cinema Museum in London's Kennington to find out more.
On the top floor of Lambeth Workhouse, where the infamous comic Charlie Chaplin spent much of his childhood, the Kennington Bioscope hosts screenings of rarely before-seen silent film. Amid the Aladdin's cave of film memorabilia, viewers can lounge in vintage tip-up cinema seats or sip drinks from the makeshift bar.
We try and programme as much as possible rare, overlooked films, things you can't see anywhere else, sometimes even supposedly lost films.
That's film editor Chris Bird, one of the volunteers who runs the Kennington Bioscope.
And the weird thing is it's amazing, and I don't quite know what the magic ingredient is, how many younger people we get, which you'll see tonight. It's not just people of a certain age, we say.
How many people normally kind of...
It took a while to recover post-COVID, but probably we're getting on average maybe 80 people, and we can only have about 110 is capacity.
Integral to the evening's entertainment is John Sweeney, who helped set up the Kennington Bioscope. John is widely recognised as one of the best silent film pianists in Europe. Before sound came into cinema in the late 1920s, silent films usually had live musical accompaniment, generally performed on a piano, which could be played wherever the screening was taking place, be it a theatre, fairground or town hall. Almost all the accompaniment John plays is improvised.
So I haven't seen the films in the first half, so I'm playing blind. I've been told about them, but I haven't seen them. You kind of develop a way of reacting to what's happening, and if you know, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you end up having played for a film and you think, I wish I'd seen that film because I would do it completely differently now. Other times you feel like you lock on to something in the film, and sometimes I feel like I've played actually the best for the film when I haven't seen it, because I've had the same kind of excitement of the audience of not knowing what's going to happen, but having a sense of the atmosphere of the film and the rhythm of the film and capturing that.
My name's Bryony Dixon. I am a curator at the BFI National Archive, and I specialise in early and silent film. So that is film made from about the 1890s up until sound comes in the late 20s.
The British Film Institute's collection spans the full spectrum of film production and hosts a monthly silent film strand aimed at bringing early cinema to the public.
We hold a huge collection, certainly one of the largest in the world. There's something like 20,000 titles. Personally, I come from a history background, so my particular passion is how you can use film from that era to tell people in a very pain-free way what life was like. You know, when you see films from the Victorian age made when Victoria was still on the throne, and you see people getting the bus to work and getting on the tube to go to work, you know, you think, actually, it's not so different.
Whilst 20,000 titles sounds expansive, Bryony says much of the original silent film has been lost. That which remains is precious, artefacts which tell us about society at the time.
What percentage are left of ones that were originally...
The number 20 is the number we nearly always use. 20% is what we have, 80% is lost. Some companies destroyed their entire holdings, or they just rotted away in vaults. Some filmmakers looked after their own material, some didn't. And then things were stored in better and worse conditions. But we do still find stuff. I acquired something yesterday where a gentleman who had a large country house was clearing out the attics and found a tin with some early film made in Italy, distributed in this country in about 1910. And it looks to be in great condition. It's in a biscuit tin. You know, that's fabulous when that happens.
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
While silent films remain a perennial fascination among cinephiles, I asked John Sweeney whether he believed the medium could continue to captivate a broad audience, as it did a century ago. Would interest in silent film fade with the next generation as audiovisual platforms like TikTok shape shorter attention spans, making it harder to engage with the sustained focus required to truly appreciate silent cinema?
The other day I played for Buster Keaton Film 1 Week, where he's building a house and it all goes horribly wrong, to a whole lot of Year 4 kids in Bromley. And it was fantastic, and they just laughed and were shocked and horrified by some bits and things like that. And actually, I realised one thing. It's real. I mean, of course, there is some sleight of hand in what he's doing, but basically he is falling off that building. He is doing it. It's not done in a computer. And when I started, I think silent films are still considered old-fashioned. The audience felt very elderly, and I thought I may not be doing this for very long because the audience is going to be dying out. But actually, I think it's kind of one of those things that's gone beyond seeming old-fashioned or out of fashion. It's gone to be, the time has elapsed sufficiently, but it seems like a completely other world. You know, and also a lot of young people, I know at the festival I play at in Italy, in Pordenone, they have this collegium where a lot of young people come and write papers about the films. And of course they're bringing all sorts of issues about gender identity and all sorts of things. You can look at these films now in a whole lot of different ways and find things of interest about how people thought. I think a whole kind of young audience is finding lots of things in these films which maybe I don't particularly strike me, but strike them because of their particular concerns and interests.
Maisie Ringer with that report, and that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Alex von Tunzelmann and Theo Usherwood. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.